In a quiet village, nestled between the rolling hills and the thick, whispering forests, there lived a girl whose presence seemed as soft and kind as the morning breeze. She was no more than 15 years of age, standing at the edge of childhood and womanhood, her spirit carrying both innocence and a budding strength that few around her chose to notice. Her days were filled with small acts of kindness that defined her character. At dawn, while others still lingered in sleep, she was already awake, carrying baskets of water from the stream, helping elders sweep their courtyards, or guiding little children by the hand when they wandered too far from home. She was not born into comfort. Her life was simple, and much of what she had was earned through effort rather than gift. Yet she moved through her days with a quiet grace, never complaining, never raising her voice in anger even when wronged. Her gentle eyes, often described as carrying the light of early morning dew, seemed to see the good in everything. When others saw broken clay pots, she saw what could be mended. When others grumbled about dry fields, she reminded them of the rains that would surely come. Her hands, though roughened by daily chores, were always the first to offer comfort. If a child scraped a knee, she cleaned the wound tenderly. If an elder struggled with heavy firewood, she bore the weight without hesitation. Though her clothes were patched and plain, her smile lit the faces of those who met her on the village path. She was not rich in material wealth, but she carried a richness of heart that made her stand apart, even if she herself did not realize it. Despite her giving nature, not everyone received her with kindness. Within her own household, the warmth she spread outside was met with coldness. Her stepmother, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, viewed the girl's innocence as weakness. Instead of seeing her helpfulness as a blessing, she twisted it into servitude, keeping the girl busy with endless tasks so she would have no time to dream too high. Her peers, especially those her age, sometimes mocked her simplicity. They laughed at the way she carried water on her head without grace, or how her hands were always dirty from tending to the soil. They whispered that she was nothing more than a servant in her own home, destined to remain unseen, uncelebrated, and unvalued. But the girl, though she sometimes felt the sting of their scorn, held her pain quietly, believing that one day, the world would see her for who she truly was. In the rare moments when she was free from work, she allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of love, not the grand love of stories, but the gentle kind where someone would see her worth and hold her with respect. She dreamed of freedom, of days when she would not be ordered about, when her hands could create not only for survival but for joy, perhaps weaving bright fabrics or planting flowers just because they were beautiful. And she dreamed of respect, not in the form of praise or wealth, but in simple recognition, where her voice would be heard and her heart valued. These dreams were tucked quietly into her soul, hidden away like seeds beneath the soil, waiting for the right time to bloom. The contrast between her nature and that of her family was stark. Where she was patient, her stepmother was impatient. Where she was giving, her stepmother was greedy. Where she forgave, her stepmother held grudges like treasures. The girl's innocence only fueled envy, for those around her saw that even without riches or power, she carried a light they could not extinguish. Her stepmother, in particular, resented this quiet glow, fearing that it might one day outshine her own children. She twisted stories, calling the girl lazy when she paused to catch her breath, or accusing her of pride when she merely lifted her gaze with quiet dignity. Each day became a test of endurance, a balancing act between serving without complaint and holding on to the small flame of self-respect that still burned inside her. And yet, the villagers who watched her from a distance could not help but notice her gentleness. Some elders spoke of her as if she carried the blessings of the ancestors, for in her presence, quarrels often softened and tempers cooled. A woman who was once bitter about her barren womb claimed that the girl's visits to help with chores brought her peace. A lonely widower found comfort in her laughter when she stopped by to fetch water from his well. Even the children who sometimes teased her sought her company when they were hurt or frightened. Without meaning to, she stitched herself into the fabric of the community, her quiet goodness becoming the thread that held many lives together. The girl herself, however, felt the weight of loneliness. She longed to be loved not for what she could give, but for who she was. She longed for a world where she was not mocked, scolded, or dismissed. But even in her sorrow, she carried herself with dignity, her kindness never faltering. She told herself that perhaps her life, though hard, had meaning, that maybe her struggles were shaping her for something greater, though she did not yet know what it was. Her life before the trials was not filled with glory or wealth. It was marked by humility, hard work, and unrecognized virtue. But it was in this ordinary life that the foundations of her strength were quietly laid. Her innocence, her compassion, and her dreams, though fragile, were seeds that would one day grow into something mighty. Those who mocked her weakness did not know that within her lay a resilience born of suffering, a strength shaped in silence, and a spirit that would one day rise from the darkness they cast her into, glowing with a power that no ridicule, no cruelty, and no chains of envy could ever destroy. Underneath the calm rhythm of village life, shadows of envy began to stir, and though the girl herself remained blissfully unaware, others watched her with hearts burning in quiet resentment. She had never sought to outshine anyone, never asked to be admired or noticed, but her very existence seemed to summon both affection and bitterness in equal measure. Some praised her kindness, her gentle ways with children and elders, the way she always offered her hands freely in times of need, yet those who carried jealousy in their hearts saw her light as a threat to their own place in the community. Her stepmother, in particular, bore the sharpest thorn of envy. Each time she saw the villagers speak warmly of the girl, her jaw tightened, her heart heavy with resentment. She told herself that such admiration was undeserved, that kindness was nothing but weakness wrapped in false sweetness. Yet what cut her deepest was how easily people seemed drawn to the girl, while her own words often slipped past unheeded, leaving her frustrated and invisible. At night, when the girl slept quietly by the hearth, the stepmother would sit in silence, staring at her, thoughts of jealousy winding tighter and tighter in her chest until they felt unbearable. Her stepsisters were no better. They had always imagined themselves to be the admired ones, the charming daughters of the household, but the glow that surrounded the girl dimmed their efforts. When they walked through the market, others greeted them politely but quickly shifted their eyes to the girl, smiling with warmth at her presence. She did not flaunt herself, nor did she seek to compete, and that only made it worse. In her humility they saw a mirror that exposed their vanity. Each compliment she received, even unintentionally, pierced them like a blade. The stepsisters began whispering behind her back, calling her falsely sweet, mocking her simplicity, inventing stories that painted her as sly or manipulative. Their laughter was forced, brittle, a mask for the unease that churned within them. Among the villagers too envy took root. Some of the young women resented the way young men admired her, though she paid them little attention. To them, her innocence was not charming but infuriating, for it only seemed to add to her allure. Mothers who once praised her began to whisper that her beauty was dangerous, that such a girl could tempt trouble into the village. Even those who once leaned on her for help began to distance themselves, murmuring warnings not to trust someone whose presence seemed too perfect. It was as though her goodness was a flame, and while some found warmth in it, others feared being burned. The whispers grew into a quiet tide. A neighbor would mention how strange it was that the girl never complained despite her hard chores, as if patience itself were suspicious. Another would say she must be hiding a cunning mind behind her soft smile. Slowly the narrative shifted, not because of anything the girl had done but because of what jealousy needed to believe. Those who envied her twisted her virtues into flaws, reshaping her image into something threatening to their fragile pride. The girl herself felt the change in the air but could not name it. She noticed how greetings became shorter, how laughter sometimes hushed when she walked by, how her stepsister's jokes about her grew sharper. She carried the sting quietly, telling herself not to let bitterness creep into her own heart. Still, her innocence left her blind to the storm building around her. She could sense unease, like a chill brushing across her skin on an otherwise warm day, but she never suspected that the small, subtle cruelties were seeds being watered with malice, preparing to sprout into something far more dangerous. In the evenings, as she helped the elders with their fires or carried water for those too weary, she often felt a pair of eyes lingering on her. Sometimes her stepmothers, sometimes her stepsisters, sometimes neighbors whose smiles no longer reached their eyes. She would brush it off with a kind word, a soft laugh, or a gentle gesture, hoping kindness might ease whatever heaviness lay in their hearts. But kindness, though powerful, cannot always disarm envy. Sometimes it only deepens it. Behind closed doors, her stepmother and stepsisters began speaking openly of their jealousy, feeding each other's bitterness with exaggerated complaints about the girl. "She acts humble only to make us look cruel," one sister muttered. "She waits for people to praise her goodness, while we are forgotten." The stepmother, her face tight with hatred, would nod in agreement, her mind already spinning with ideas of how to push the girl further from admiration and closer to disgrace. The villagers, too, became willing participants in quiet cruelty. A rumor here, a mocking remark there. Soon the air was thick with suspicion, like smoke drifting unseen through a house until it chokes the lungs. Yet even in the face of this gathering malice, the girl's gentle nature never faltered. She still rose early to help, still smiled softly at those who mocked her, still dreamed quietly of love, freedom, and respect. She did not know that her dreams themselves had become sparks that ignited envy in others, who could not bear to see someone so undesiring of power receive what they themselves longed for. And so, jealousy settled like a silent predator in the village, circling the girl. The whispers, the gossip, the mocking, all were but threads weaving into a larger design, one that would soon pull her into danger she could not yet imagine. The air seemed calm on the surface, but beneath it was tension waiting to break, and though the girl remained pure in her thoughts, the world around her had already begun sharpening its claws against her gentle spirit. It began quietly, like a plan whispered between shadows, each step stitched with malice yet concealed beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life. The girl never suspected that the very people she had tried to love and serve were preparing to betray her in the cruelest way. The whispers of envy had ripened into resolve, and those who resented her light longed to extinguish it, to plunge her into a darkness where her glow could no longer shame them. Her stepmother's bitterness guided the plot, sharp and deliberate. She waited for the right evening, a time when the villagers would be distracted by celebration, laughter, and dancing around the fires. On such a night, when no one would notice the absence of one quiet girl, she laid her trap. The stepsisters played their part eagerly, their laughter ringing false as they spoke sweetly to the girl, asking her to come with them, to help fetch something important for their mother. Their voices were honey, but their hearts were poisoned. The girl followed without suspicion. She was used to being asked to do the hardest chores, to carry burdens heavier than her shoulders could bear. That night she thought it no different. She carried a small basket, her hands steady but her mind filled with innocent thoughts. She wondered if perhaps for once her family wanted to include her in something special, some secret meant to make her feel like she belonged. A fragile hope flickered in her chest and she clung to it, blind to the cruelty ahead. The path grew darker as they led her away from the lights of the village. At first she said nothing, only glancing back once at the faint glow of torches and fires behind them. The stepsisters whispered to each other, their words too low for her to catch, and though unease stirred in her, she silenced it with trust. When the ground beneath her feet turned rocky and strange, she finally asked, "Where are we going?" Her voice was soft, touched with curiosity, but the sisters only answered with tight smiles. "Just a little farther. You'll see." They led her to the edge of a hollow pit, one hidden by brush and stone. It was a place few dared to go, a place whispered of in childhood as cursed as the home of shadows. The girl looked down into the void, her heart quickening at the sight of the gaping darkness. A shiver ran through her, though the night was warm. She turned to her sisters, her lips parting to question them again, but before she could speak, their hands were upon her. The shove came suddenly, cruelly. For an instant, her arms flailed, reaching for something solid, but only air met her grasp. She felt the earth slip away beneath her feet as her body plunged downward. The world became a blur of rushing wind, snapping branches, and the sharp sting of stone against her skin. She struck the bottom hard, pain flashing through her body, leaving her gasping for breath. Above her, the stepsisters' faces peered into the pit, faint in the torchlight. Their eyes gleamed with a cold triumph that twisted her heart. "Stay there," one of them whispered mockingly. "This is where you belong." Then their silhouettes vanished as they pulled the branches back across the pit, sealing her in as though burying her alive. The last sliver of light disappeared, and the girl was left in suffocating blackness. At first she lay still, her chest heaving, her mind too dazed to understand what had happened. Slowly the reality of betrayal seeped in like poison. Her family, those she had served, endured and forgiven, had thrown her away. Fear rose within her like a tide, crushing her chest, making her hands tremble. She pressed her palms to the damp earth, feeling its chill seep into her skin, and the weight of darkness pressed down on her from all sides. Her thoughts twisted between confusion and heartbreak. Why had her kindness, her patience, earned her only cruelty? She replayed moments of small laughter with her sisters, fleeting kindness from her stepmother, wondering if any of it had been real, or if it had all been masks leading to this moment. Tears slipped down her cheeks, unseen in the dark, her sobs muffled against her own hands. The silence of the pit wrapped around her like chains, and in that silence she felt the full force of loneliness, sharper than any wound. Fear gnawed at her as she stretched out her hands, finding only stone and dirt. The air was thick, damp, heavy, and the longer she sat, the more it felt as though it would smother her. Each sound, a drip of water, a distant rustle, made her heart race, for she could not tell if the darkness was empty or if something else waited with her. She hugged her knees to her chest, whispering small prayers, clinging to hope though hope felt faint, a candle on the edge of being blown out. Time blurred in the dark. She could not tell if minutes or hours had passed. Every ache in her body screamed of the fall, but her heart screamed louder of betrayal. The faces of those she had trusted burned in her mind, now twisted with cruelty. The realization cut deeper than any physical pain, that her light had not been enough to soften their envy, that her love had not been enough to keep her safe. And yet, even in her fear, something inside her stirred. Beneath the confusion, beneath the heartbreak, there was a flicker of resistance, fragile but steady. Though the darkness wrapped around her, it could not erase the truth of who she was. Still at that moment, her body trembled, her spirit reeled, and she sat small and broken, swallowed whole by shadow. Her enemies had cast her into darkness, believing they had silenced her forever. And in that moment she believed it too, as despair threatened to take her whole. The pit became her world, a place of damp stone, cold earth, and a silence so heavy it seemed to smother her very breath. At first the girl could not comprehend how long she had been there, whether it was hours, a night, or longer. Time dissolved in the darkness, replaced by the constant ache in her limbs and the hollow cry of her stomach. Each shift of her body against the jagged floor sent sharp pain through her bruises, reminding her of the fall and of the betrayal that had cast her here. Hunger gnawed at her slowly, first as a whisper, then as a roar, twisting her stomach until it felt as though it might consume itself. Thirst burned in her throat, her lips cracked, and even her voice faltered when she tried to whisper prayers. Her body weakened, but her mind bore the crueler torment. Images replayed over and over, the shove of her sisters, the faint smirk of her stepmother as the trap was laid, the closing of branches over the pit's mouth. Betrayal became a blade that never stopped cutting. She asked herself endless questions. Why had her kindness never been enough? Why had the love she gave so freely only been met with cruelty? Had she truly been so weak, so useless, that her family saw her as nothing but a burden to cast away? The questions hollowed her spirit, and despair pressed in from all sides. At times she screamed, her voice bouncing back from the walls of the pit, sounding small and broken in the endless dark. At other times she sat utterly still, her arms wrapped around her knees, her head pressed down as though she could fold herself into nothingness. Loneliness weighed heavier than hunger or thirst. It was the kind of silence that made her believe she no longer existed, that the world above had forgotten her. She imagined life in the village carrying on. Fires lit, laughter spilling out, her sisters wearing smug smiles, her stepmother living untouched by guilt. The thought cut deeply, and with every heartbeat she felt herself fading. And yet, somewhere in that bleakness, a different kind of silence began to speak to her. At first it was subtle, a faint warmth that would brush across her skin like a breeze, though there was no wind in the pit. Then came the faintest sounds, so quiet she wondered if she had dreamed them. A hum, a vibration in the stone, like a song without words. She pressed her palms against the damp walls, and though they were rough and cold, she swore she felt a pulse beneath them, like the earth itself was alive, keeping watch over her. Nights, if they could be called nights, were the hardest. Darkness on top of darkness, pressing down until it felt unbearable. But in those hours her dreams began to change. She saw flashes of light, strange and shifting, fireflies glowing in impossible patterns, a river shining silver, a great tree whose roots reached down into the pit as though to cradle her. In one dream, a voice spoke, not in words she understood, but in a rhythm that made her heart steady. When she woke, her chest still carried its echo, and she no longer trembled quite so violently. Her survival instincts sharpened. She began to gather what little strength she could, feeling the contours of her prison, memorizing every crack in stone. She scraped her fingers against the walls, collecting drops of condensation to wet her parched lips. She stretched her body in slow, painful movements, keeping herself from collapsing completely. Her mind, too, began to shift. Where once there had been only despair, now there were questions of a different kind. Could the whispers mean something? Was she truly abandoned, or was something watching over her in this darkness? One night, when her body trembled with exhaustion and she believed her end was near, she opened her eyes into the blackness and thought she saw a faint glow. It hovered briefly like a firefly, then vanished. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of her weakening senses. But it returned the next night, brighter, lingering a little longer. She reached for it, and though her hand closed on empty air, she felt warmth seep into her palm, as though some unseen force had touched her back. She began to believe that the darkness was not only a prison, it was also a womb, a place meant to strip her bare so that something new could be born. The whispers in the stone grew clearer, the glow steadier. Sometimes when she closed her eyes she felt as though the earth itself breathed with her, teaching her patience, teaching her to endure. The girl who had been thrown into the pit was not the same girl who now endured its crushing silence. Hunger, thirst, and betrayal had broken her body, but in the pieces of herself she began to find something unexpected: resilience. Her kindness had once been seen as weakness, but in the depths, it became her strength. She realized that even abandoned she could forgive the world, but she could also rise against those who sought to destroy her. Her tears no longer fell as helpless cries but as a release, washing her spirit clean, making room for something fiercer to take root. Though she remained trapped in darkness, hope no longer felt like a lie. She had begun to sense it in the earth, in her dreams, in the faint glow that seemed to visit her when she needed it most. Something was watching, guiding, and though she did not yet understand what it was, she knew it had chosen her. She was not finished. The darkness that was meant to bury her was slowly shaping her, preparing her for the moment when she would rise again, different, unrecognizable, glowing with a power none would expect. At first she thought the darkness was only a cage, a cruel design to erase her existence. But the longer she endured, the more she realized the shadows were not empty. They listened. They spoke. In her quietest moments, when her stomach screamed for food and her body ached from stillness, she began to notice something new stirring within her. It started as the faintest thrum in her chest, a heartbeat that did not feel like her own, as though something greater had folded itself inside her ribs. She would close her eyes and feel warmth radiating out from her center, spreading through her arms and legs, steadying her trembling hands. It was courage, small, fragile, but undeniably alive. One night, as she pressed her ear against the damp wall of her prison, she heard a sound that could not be explained. A rhythm, soft and patient, echoing like drums far away. It soothed her racing heart, reminding her of the village dances she had once watched from the shadows. In that pulsing beat, she felt less alone, as though the ancestors themselves were reminding her she was part of a story larger than her pain. She whispered to them in return, asking if they could hear her, if they had abandoned her as everyone else had. In the silence that followed, she felt a hand, imaginary or real, rest gently on her shoulder, and her fear dimmed. Her mind, once weighed down by despair, began to sharpen. She recalled the cruel laughter of her stepmother and the cutting words of those who mocked her weakness. Each memory no longer tore her down, it built her resolve. If she had survived this far without food, without light, without kindness, then perhaps her spirit carried more strength than anyone had ever believed. She began to test her body, flexing her limbs, moving deliberately even in the cramped space, refusing to let them stiffen into weakness. With each stretch, with each careful breath, she whispered to herself, "I am still alive. I'm still here." Dreams came more frequently, no longer just flickers of strange images but vivid visions. In one, she stood beneath a vast sky filled with stars that bent low to listen to her whispers. In another, a river of fire surged past her, its flames not burning but warming, illuminating her face with fierce light. Once, she dreamed of a woman cloaked in white feathers, her eyes glowing like embers. The woman's voice rang like thunder, though her lips did not move. "You are not meant to die in darkness. You are meant to rise." These visions became her sustenance, each one nourishing her when her body threatened to collapse. The whispers in the pit grew clearer too. Sometimes they sounded like her late mother's voice, gentle and protective. At other times they were sharp like the clash of spears, commanding her to endure, to sharpen her soul as a blade is sharpened against stone. Each whisper reminded her that her suffering was not meaningless, it was preparation. Small events confirmed this awakening. Once, when she thought she would faint from hunger, a trickle of water dripped from the wall directly into her cupped hands. Another time, a faint glow bloomed at her fingertips when she rubbed them together in the dark, like sparks waiting to become flame. She gasped, thinking it a trick of her weary eyes, but the light returned whenever her heart beat faster, as though it rose in answer to her courage. She began to see patterns in the darkness. The jagged walls formed shapes she had overlooked before, lines like symbols, circles like eyes watching her. She traced them with her fingers and felt a hum beneath her skin, as though the very stones carried messages from the unseen. Sometimes, when she recited old songs her mother had taught her, the air would vibrate faintly, echoing her voice. It felt as though the darkness was no longer her enemy but a teacher, showing her what she had carried all along. Her courage blossomed slowly, not in grand explosions but in steady embers. She stopped weeping as often, her tears replaced by long silences of reflection. When fear rose, she met it with questions instead of surrender. What if I am stronger than they believe? What if this pit is not the end but the beginning? These thoughts, once unthinkable, now came with clarity. She realized her intelligence, long overlooked, had always been a strength. In the village, her ideas had been dismissed, her quiet wisdom drowned by mockery. Here, her mind became her greatest weapon. She memorized her dreams as though they were maps, piecing together their symbols. The glowing river, the feathered woman, the hand on her shoulder, all pointed to a destiny far beyond the cruelty of her stepmother. For the first time, she believed her life carried meaning, that her suffering was not punishment but transformation. The whispers grew bolder, almost like a chorus. Rise. Endure. Remember who you are. She repeated them until they became her mantra. With every breath, she drew power from the darkness instead of letting it suffocate her. Her body remained weak, but her spirit no longer trembled. She had learned to listen to the silence, to trust the visions, to let courage replace fear. And in one unforgettable moment, as she sat with her hands pressed to the earth beneath her, she felt the ground itself shiver faintly. It was as if the world had acknowledged her awakening, as if the spirits had finally placed their mark upon her. She smiled in the darkness, a small, fierce smile. The girl who had been mocked as weak, thrown away like refuse, was no longer the same. She had discovered the spark inside her, a power that could not be buried. She knew then that her story was not ending in the pit. The whispers, the visions, the strange glow at her fingertips, all were signs of what was coming. Her enemies had buried her in darkness, but they had also planted her in the soil where her true self would grow. Soon, when the time was right, she would emerge, not as the fragile girl they once mocked, but as something stronger, brighter, and unshakable. The darkness that once felt like a tomb slowly transformed into her forge. The girl no longer trembled in fear, nor did she wait helplessly for fate to decide her end. Instead, she began to rise within herself, step by step, shaping her spirit as if it were clay in the hands of a determined sculptor. Every vision she had seen, every whisper she had heard in the silence of her confinement, became a seed of transformation. She began to train, not in the sense of swinging blades or carrying heavy stones, but in the discipline of mind, spirit, and body. She tested her endurance, forcing herself to stand longer, to move in the cramped space despite exhaustion, to control her breathing when panic threatened to overwhelm her. With each small victory she learned the art of resilience, a strength more enduring than brute force. It was during these long stretches of silence that her mentors appeared, not always in physical form, but in the shapes of dreams and voices woven into the fabric of the darkness. The woman cloaked in white feathers returned in her visions, her eyes burning like twin suns, teaching her the power of focus. Do not waste your energy in fear, the voice would say. Channel it. Shape it. Fear is a fire, you may let it burn you or you may learn to hold it and use it as light. At first, the girl doubted, trembling as she tried to hold her fear still, but the more she listened, the more she realized that she could indeed mold it. When her heart raced, instead of letting it unravel her, she breathed into it, steadying the rhythm until calm returned. Slowly she was learning the strategy of survival, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. Yet the spirits were not her only mentors. In her mind's eye, she saw her late mother, who had once taught her how to weave baskets and sing lullabies to calm storms. The memory of her mother's patient hands and quiet strength became a guide for her. She recalled every lesson her mother had left her, not just practical skills but philosophies whispered between chores. Do not meet cruelty with despair. Meet it with endurance. Those words, forgotten in the noise of suffering, now returned like guiding stars. In honoring them, she found herself not only surviving but growing. Her body also began to adapt. Weak at first, she pushed herself to move despite the hunger. She counted her steps, timed her movements, forced her legs to bend and stretch. The small exercises became her rebellion against captivity, a way to declare, "You will not break me." Her arms grew leaner, her body tougher. Her skin, once soft, now bore the marks of survival. But far more important than the change in her body was the discipline blooming within her mind. She learned patience, focus, and the sharpness of observation. In silence, she had begun to notice everything: the rhythm of water trickling, the shifts of the air, the hum in the stone. She realized that if she paid attention, nothing was truly hidden from her. Then came her first true test. One night, the pit seemed to grow colder than usual, a suffocating chill that made her teeth chatter and her breath turn ragged. The whispers around her grew faint, almost mocking, as though daring her to collapse. For a moment, despair clawed at her chest, telling her to surrender. But she closed her eyes and remembered the feathered woman's voice. She pictured herself wrapped not in shadows but in flames, and as she focused, warmth spread through her chest again. Her body calmed, her breath steadied. That night, she endured, and when she awoke the next day, she felt as though she had passed through a gate. She was no longer merely surviving, she had conquered her first trial. Each victory after that grew larger. She discovered that her glowing fingertips could produce faint sparks when she rubbed her palms together in focus. At first, it frightened her, but soon she treated it as a gift, practicing until she could call upon it at will. It was not yet fire, not yet light, but it was energy, proof that the spirits were shaping her for something greater. With each flicker, her confidence grew, and her awareness of her own potential deepened. When her enemies had thrown her into the pit, they had imagined her breaking into pieces, consumed by fear and weakness. Instead, the girl was being sharpened into a weapon. She was not yet fully risen, but every whisper, every vision, every exercise in patience and endurance was carving away the parts of her that once doubted, leaving behind a core of steel. She began to think strategically, no longer dwelling on her pain but imagining what would come after. She rehearsed conversations in her mind, envisioning how she would face her tormentors, how she would walk through the village with a presence they could no longer mock or dismiss. She even began to laugh softly at night, a low sound that startled her at first but soon became a comfort. It was the laugh of someone who had begun to see herself not as a victim but as the keeper of a hidden power. Her transformation was not sudden but steady, a slow bloom in the soil where her enemies thought she would decay. The girl who once trembled under insults was now learning to wield silence as strength. The girl who once cried herself to sleep now whispered promises of vengeance to the shadows. And with each passing day she grew closer to becoming the person the spirits had shown her in dreams, glowing, unyielding, and powerful. The darkness no longer felt like her grave. It had become her training ground, her secret chamber of transformation. And though she had not yet emerged, she already knew that when she stepped into the light again, she would not return as the girl they had mocked or buried. She would rise as something far greater, resilient, strategic, and unshakably strong. The path from darkness to light was neither sudden nor effortless, but when the moment finally arrived, it unfolded with a force that seemed destined, as if the very world had been holding its breath for her emergence. For days, perhaps weeks, perhaps even longer, for time had blurred in that place, she had grown stronger, sharper, and braver. The shadows that once pressed upon her chest no longer crushed her. Instead, they bowed to her will, becoming her teachers, her forge. Every ounce of fear had been burned away, every tear turned into strength. When she finally stood, ready to reclaim her place in the world, she was no longer the same fragile girl who had been thrown into the abyss. Her first steps toward freedom were deliberate. The walls of her prison, whether of stone or tangled roots of shadow, had long been barriers meant to confine her. But now she traced them with her hands, her fingers glowing faintly as though lit from within. Where once she had recoiled from the suffocating blackness, she now commanded it, bending it back, shaping a path forward. Each step was accompanied by an odd hum in the air, as though the darkness itself sang in recognition of her transformation. The physical struggle was immense. She clawed her way upward, sometimes slipping, sometimes bruising her hands and knees, but she did not falter. Her breathing was steady, her eyes alight with something fierce, something unbreakable. At moments when the path seemed sealed, when heavy rocks or chains barred her way, she would pause, close her eyes, and feel the quiet force within her. Then, with a calm determination, she would move forward again, pushing, lifting, unraveling the obstacles with a strength that came not just from muscle, but from conviction. As she rose closer to the surface, faint traces of light began to break into her dark world. A single sliver at first, so thin she could barely tell if it was real or imagined, cut across the shadows. But it grew, widened, until it became a golden line that seemed to beckon her forward. She reached for it, her heart racing. That glow was not just light, it was a reflection of what she had become. With one final heave, she broke through the last barrier, and the darkness released her. The world that greeted her gasped. The villagers who had gathered, whether out of curiosity, malice, or disbelief, froze where they stood. For when she emerged, she was no longer the girl they had known. She was radiant. Her skin carried a soft glow, as though kissed by the fire of hidden stars. Her eyes, once gentle and timid, now held a commanding brilliance that seemed to pierce through lies and fear alike. Her hair, tangled yet flowing, shimmered faintly as though light itself had woven through its strands. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices trembling with awe. Some dropped to their knees, unsure whether they were in the presence of a spirit, a goddess, or a girl reborn. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, their wide eyes reflecting admiration rather than fear. Even those who had once mocked her or plotted her downfall could not speak. Their throats tightened with dread as they realized what they had done and who she had become. She stood tall at the edge of the darkness, her posture unyielding, her aura commanding respect. The silence that followed her emergence was heavy, sacred, as though even the wind and the earth waited for her first words. She did not rush. She looked around, meeting the eyes of those gathered. In that moment, they saw not only the suffering she had endured but also the power she now carried, a power greater than any cruelty they had inflicted upon her. Her emergence was more than survival, it was a transformation into a living symbol. Where once she had been the embodiment of innocence and vulnerability, she now represented resilience, justice, and unstoppable will. The darkness had not broken her, it had reforged her into something greater. Villagers bowed their heads, some in shame, others in reverence, while the whispers spread from lip to lip. She has returned glowing with power. The girl breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the air of freedom, of life renewed. Her heart swelled not with vengeance in that moment, but with the certainty that she had claimed her destiny. She was no longer the girl cast aside, no longer a victim. She was something entirely new, someone whose name would be remembered, whose story would echo through generations as a lesson, a warning, and an inspiration. Her emergence was not simply her own triumph, it was the beginning of a new order, one where those who once despised her would bow, and those who believed in goodness would find strength in her light. And as she stood there, glowing with power and respect, even the setting sun seemed to linger in the sky, as if it refused to dim in the presence of her newfound radiance. When she finally walked back into the village, the very ground seemed to shift beneath the feet of those who had known her before. The path she took was the same dirt road she had once traveled countless times, carrying baskets of water, firewood, or goods for others. Yet now, each step landed with a weight that carried more than the soft sound of her bare feet. It carried authority, purpose, and a presence that made people turn and stare before they even realized why. Children were the first to notice her. They had once giggled at her tattered dresses and whispered behind their hands when their parents called her cursed or unwanted. But now their laughter died in their throats. They tugged at their mother's skirts, pointing wide-eyed as the girl, who had disappeared into darkness, returned. She was the same and not the same. Her figure was slender as before, her face familiar, but there was something undeniably different. A glow that was not of ornaments or jewels but of the spirit itself. The meek eyes that had once lowered at every insult now held a steady fire, sharp and calm all at once. Women who had pitied her secretly, who had sighed but done nothing to help, found themselves stepping back, their baskets forgotten in their hands. They whispered hurriedly to one another, "Is that truly her? The one who was thrown away? How does she walk so tall? How does she glow like that?" Their voices trembled with both awe and guilt. In their hearts, they remembered their silence, their complicity. Now, faced with her return, they felt as if she carried not only her power but also a mirror of their cowardice. The men who had jeered at her or turned their faces away shuffled uneasily as they watched her stride past. Some bowed their heads without realizing it. Others crossed their arms tightly, as though they could shield themselves from the weight of her presence. It was not just her appearance that silenced them, it was the memory of who she had been. They remembered the timid girl who bent beneath cruelty, who never fought back when mocked or beaten down. That girl should have been broken by the darkness. Yet here she was, radiant and unyielding, standing straighter than any of them could remember. Her clothes told part of the story. They were simple as they had always been, yet somehow transformed by the way she wore them. The fabric clung lightly to her form, and every thread seemed touched by an otherworldly shimmer, though no one could tell if it was real or imagined. Her hair, once tangled by neglect, now framed her face with a wild grace, strands catching the light of the sun as if woven with fire. Around her was an air of dignity that no jewel, no crown, could imitate. The villagers fell into uneasy silence, the kind that made even birds pause in their song. Step by step, she moved toward the heart of the village where her enemies waited. Each movement carried memory. This was the same square where she had once knelt to scrub stones, where laughter had rained down on her from cruel mouths. She did not falter as she approached, though her heart beat heavy with everything she remembered. It was not fear that quickened her pulse but anticipation. For the first time she would not endure in silence. She would confront. The stepmother who had orchestrated her fall was among the crowd. Her face twisted when she saw the girl, disbelief written in every line of her expression. She had expected never to see her again, had expected her to be swallowed forever by the darkness. Now she stared at the glowing figure approaching, and though her lips curled in disdain, her eyes betrayed her. A flash of fear, a flicker of recognition that something beyond her control had returned to undo her. Villagers leaned forward, drawn to the unfolding moment as if pulled by invisible strings. They had seen the girl before but never like this. Her once bowed shoulders were square, her gaze steady, her steps slow and deliberate, like someone who had no need to rush, because power itself walked with her. Even those who had never spoken a word to her felt the weight of her return. This was not just a girl coming home, it was a reckoning carried on 2 feet, wrapped in human form yet more than human in presence. The tension grew as she reached the center. Children no longer tugged at skirts, they simply stared, their mouths open. Men cleared their throats and shuffled their feet. Women whispered furiously, torn between awe and fear. The stepmother clenched her fists. Rivals who had once taken delight in her suffering shrank back, their pride crumbling under her silent stare. The girl paused there, standing beneath the same sun that had once beaten down on her as she labored and endured humiliation. But now the sun seemed to illuminate her differently, as though it too recognized the change. She raised her head, let her eyes sweep across the gathered faces, and in the silence that followed, every villager felt the air grow heavy, expectant. It was as if the earth itself waited for her to speak, for her to act. Her return was not just the reappearance of someone thought gone. It was the unveiling of someone transformed, someone who had conquered what should have destroyed her. The villagers could see it, could feel it. And with that recognition came a ripple of unease and awe, because they knew nothing would ever be the same again. The murmurs of the villagers quieted as the girl finally raised her voice. It was not loud, yet it carried with a clarity that pierced every heart. She began not with anger but with truth. One by one she spoke the names of those who had mocked, deceived, and betrayed her. She recounted their deeds with calm precision, stripping away every lie and excuse they had once used to cover their cruelty. Each word landed like a stone, and the villagers could not look away. They remembered. They had seen. They had laughed. And now the truth stood before them, undeniable. Her stepmother tried to shout over her, to dismiss her words as madness, but the crowd no longer listened to the old voice of deceit. The stepmother's trembling hands betrayed her as much as the fear in her eyes. The villagers turned on her, not with weapons but with judgment. Whispers of shame spread like fire in dry grass. All her power, built on manipulation, began to crumble in that moment, stripped away by exposure. She had hidden darkness in her heart and cloaked it as authority, but now the girl's light revealed it in full. Others who had mocked her found themselves shrinking into the background. The men who had jeered, the women who had scorned her kindness, the youths who had thrown stones or spat cruel words, none could escape the weight of her gaze. It was not hatred they saw in her eyes but something heavier, justice. She did not need to scream or strike them. Their own shame became punishment enough, their reputations crumbling as the truth was spoken aloud. The girl's words were not only accusations but also a declaration of balance restored. She spoke of the laws of the earth and the spirits that watched unseen, reminding the villagers that no cruelty goes unnoticed. Her suffering had been the seed of her strength, and now that strength had grown into a force that demanded accountability. Her enemies had stolen her dignity, tried to bury her in darkness, but in doing so they had buried themselves. When she finished, there was silence. The stepmother, once proud and commanding, was left with nothing but the hollow echo of her own greed. The villagers, humbled and shaken, turned their eyes to the girl not as a victim but as the one who had survived, risen, and returned with a power that did not belong to cruelty but to justice itself. She had become the balance their community had forgotten. And in that silence, the truth settled like a stone in water, spreading ripples that would be remembered for generations. The girl's presence became more than a memory of suffering. It became the foundation of a new way of life for the village. Where once she had been mocked and discarded, she now walked with her head high, and every step seemed to carry light. People who had once turned their backs now sought her counsel. They came not only for forgiveness but for guidance, for they sensed in her a wisdom that went beyond ordinary years. Her words, once ignored, now carried the weight of prophecy, and her silence alone could stir reflection in the hearts of even the proudest elders. Her story spread beyond her own home and family. Children whispered it as they played in the fields, shaping her trials into songs and chants. Mothers told it by the fireside, not as a tale of despair but as a lesson in courage. Fathers who once dismissed her as weak now pointed to her as proof that true strength was not found in muscle or loud voices but in resilience and integrity. Slowly the culture of the village shifted. Cruel laughter gave way to respect. Envy gave way to admiration. The The people, once quick to condemn, learned to pause and reflect before judging. The girl herself did not rule them as a queen or demand worship. Instead, she became something rarer, a living symbol of balance. She walked among them, helping where she could, guiding with fairness, reminding them of the spirit's watchful eyes. Some said they saw a glow around her at night, faint but steady, like the warmth of a hidden flame. Others swore that when she spoke, the wind seemed to carry her voice farther than ordinary sound. Whether truth or myth, these stories wrapped her in an aura of protection that no enemy dared to challenge again. Her stepmother's downfall remained a warning etched in memory. Greed and cruelty had led to ruin, while kindness and endurance had birthed power. The villagers carried that lesson into their lives, treating one another with greater care. Where once selfishness had divided them, they began to share more, to listen more, to support the vulnerable rather than mock them. The girl's struggle had planted seeds of unity, and those seeds grew. In time, she became more than just a survivor of cruelty, she became the protector of her people. Those who traveled from distant villages came to hear her story, and some left with blessings or words that seemed to change their fate. The people began to believe that mystical forces moved through her, ensuring prosperity, guarding the harvest and keeping storms at bay. Her name was spoken in reverence, not as one set apart but as one who reminded them of what humanity and spirit could achieve together. Generations later, long after her steps no longer pressed the earth, the glow of her story remained. The villagers taught their children to honor courage, to protect the innocent, and to remember that no darkness could bury the truth forever. Her legacy was not just survival, it was transformation. She had walked out of the shadows glowing, and that glow illuminated the path for all who came after.